Hello, everybody. This is Zach at it again. I'm your host, Zach Cooley, and I am very happy to be here with actually my middle school principal. But Sid, you and I have known each other even before I came to Scott Memorial. I can remember you. My dad was chief deputy, and I was just very, very little, and you were on the board of supervisors.
That's exactly right. I remember well. That was my first acquaintance with you. I've known you, gosh, for years and years.
Yes, most of my life, and it's a pleasure to have you with me today, Sid. Thank you so much for being a part of my program.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity. I don't know that I can help it. I'll be glad to try.
But we are here today to talk about something. Our mutual friend, my dear, dear friend, Linda Diorio, who is a faithful member of the Wytheville Presbyterian Church for many, many years, and her family. She approached me with the task of doing a brief history of the Wytheville Presbyterian Church for their 200th anniversary celebration, which is coming up here the first weekend in October. You're going to give a special historical presentation of that, and I'm sure that is going to be very interesting. I have combed through what I believe you had a part in some historical papers that Linda sent me. So I'm just going to basically go through what I have here and have you expound on it. Now, let's talk a little bit about, before we get into the history, some of the things that people can expect if they come to the celebration. Now, this is open to the public, right? And anyone can attend.
That's correct.
Okay. And things are going to start first on Saturday, October 7th at 5:30 p.m. A light supper will be provided, followed by a performance by Celtic Sessions, who will perform a collection of Scotch-Irish folk songs, which is a very important part of the heritage, I think, of everyone in Wytheville, but specifically for the members of the Wytheville Presbyterian Church. Can you explain why the Scotch-Irish what the performance by Celtic Sessions would be so pertinent to the church in particular?
Sure. The history of the Presbyterians in our area, and we have several families still as members and participants of the Wytheville Church, as well as the other churches here in the county, that actually their ancestors go back to those first settlers. The settlers in Southwest Virginia were largely Scotch-Irish, and those people came to this area in two streams, mostly in the early 1700s. And as you had mentioned to me before, that brings about what was kind of a split in the Presbyterian Church early. But what was called, later became called the Old School Presbyterians, are the ones that we in Virginia are more familiar with because of our background with Virginia history. They were settlers that came across the mountain from the Williamsburg and Jamestown area, and most of those were very early settlers to the Virginia colonies. Right. A little bit later, but not terribly later, still in the late 1600s to early 1700s, a lot more Scotch-Irish people, and the Scotch-Irish were really mostly Presbyterian. They came in through the port of Philadelphia and spread in that area around the Pennsylvania valleys, and eventually came down the valleys and settled into this area too. So we had Presbyterians coming really in two different groups to the area of Southwest Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, all of this area, which was the wilderness at that time.
Right.
And the ones that came from the Williamsburg area, or what were being called kind of the old school Presbyterians, they were more formal with their worship, and especially more formal, I think, with the requirements for education of their ministers.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that, I think, that goes back to their attachment in Williamsburg with the Church of England and the Episcopals there, the ties and actually the legal ties that those people had to the church in Williamsburg. Then the Presbyterians that came down the valley were later called the New School Presbyterians.
Mm-hmm.
They were more informal. They were what we think of as kind of being the frontiersmen of this area, and not as formal with a lot of things, more open to change. And they did not have as many requirements. They all went back to John Calvin and the Presbyterianism of him, the elected form of government, which really, theologically, Presbyterians are not that much different from a lot of the other Protestant congregations.
Right.
But their church government was more different. They really believed in the elected system of representative government. Mm-hmm. And that was the difference. These people believed in that, but the New School was much more informal than the Old School, and actually some of those differences prevailed all the way into the Civil War. And there were both Old School and New School churches in Wytheville, although I think there was a lot of intermingling between them. If you look at those early rolls, some of the names on them are not the same, but like, as my own family, there were actually Crockett's that were part of both congregations, so there must have been a good bit of interaction between them.
Absolutely. And that split, according to my history, if that's correct, if I copied the notes correctly, happened in 1837.
Formally it did. There was actually a split in the Presbyterian Church of the United States, and of course, churches have split for lots of reasons, but that was one split in the Presbyterian Church. And up until then, the congregations had pretty much been the same in this area, and there were churches like we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of our church, so it goes back to 1823.
Yep.
And then, as you said, in the 1830s, there was actually a formal split for Old School and New School, and at that point, there were one of the groups split in Wytheville and built the other Presbyterian church, and for a while, there were two Presbyterian churches in Wytheville.
Right. And coming back to 1823, when the church was founded, it was founded even before Wytheville was Wytheville. It was still known as Evesham.
Correct.
And it was originally dubbed Mount Tabor Presbyterian Church. Reverend James McConnell, aided by Reverend Stephen Bevall, formed the church because a man named William Hay had the desire to build a Presbyterian house of worship in Evesham. So, and he sold his land to Charles L. Crockett, which I'm assuming is one of your relatives, and James
goes back that far.
And James E. Brown. Their wives were charter members of the church. So, can you explain? Do you know anything about Mr. Hayes' desire, why he wanted specifically a Presbyterian church in Wytheville? Was there a specific reason, or?
I think it was, and that was at the point, Zach, where not only Presbyterians but some of the other denominations were actually formally organizing churches, and these people were interested in the number of people in this area who were the old Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and making an organization so that they would have their own churches. And that's how those churches began to come about. Okay,
and then we come to, I found something very interesting. On September 17th, 1841, in a letter dated on that date, church member Ann Dabney Stewart Brown, who is the aunt of legendary Civil War figure, Jeb Stewart, penned a letter to Reverend Francis McFarland in hopes of retaining him and bridging the gap between the denominational divisions. She writes, "I feel at liberty to invite my old school brethren to come. I'm extremely anxious for you to be one of the ministers. I need say no more on the subject except that our church is in as cold a state as it can be." What can you expound on that?
I have seen and read that letter. Actually, Davy Davis and I have talked about that letter a little bit. I'm not sure whether she had great results or not, but I think it goes to just exactly what we were talking about the split between the two. Mm-hmm. And you can tell by the letter she was not real happy with some of the things that were going on. I don't honestly know. I know she was asking some of those people to be more active. I don't know whether she was successful with that or not. At that time, the churches did pretty much remain the same. It was a little bit later that they split, and one church was built up on Main Street, actually in the area there where the old Greyhound bus station is.
Right.
Is where one of the two churches were built, and the other one was down in the area close to where the current Presbyterian Church is. The first Presbyterian Church, we think, was kind of in the area where 3rd and Franklin Street is, but there were no deeds registered or anything about it. And the first formal Presbyterian Church was there close to where the current church is, maybe where the Barnett's funeral home lot is, somewhere in that area. That church was later taken down, and the foundation for the church that stands there now was built. The old school people built the church up on Main Street, as I said, where the Greyhound bus station is. That church was active really until the Civil War, and I think the Civil War had a big effect on the Presbyterian Church. That's part of the history I'd like to know more about, and I don't know where to find it. But in 1864, the congregations really came back together. Those were the dark days for the South of the Civil War, and the congregations came back together, I think in about August of 1864, and came to the new church, the church that's on Church Street, which was dedicated in 1863, which was New School. So the old school Presbyterian Church was closed at that time, and a lot of people talk about that church was burned by the last grade Union soldiers to Wytheville in December of 1864. Some people say that church was closed or stopped operating because of the being burned in the raid. But I think most of the histories tell you that the congregations actually combined about August of 1864, and that church on Main Street was vacant, and probably because it was vacant, the Confederacy was storing supplies in it, and because of those supplies, that's why the Union forces burned it at that time.
Right.
After that, the churches, the two congregations came back together, and since then, I really have not found much history that says there were differences as far as the old school and new school go. There have been other differences, but that was not been one of them.
Right. And we must acknowledge here that it was around the time that we are talking about, the Crockett's Cove Presbyterian Church was built in 1858, and that is the site of the famous Civil War Battle of Cove Mountain in July of 1864. And as you said, in August 1858, the New School Presbyterians demolished the building on Church Street by the order of the Union Army, and the cornerstone for the new church was laid a 30 by 50 building, and present was a member of the Masons who would go on to be very famous. That was the eventual General William Terry. So,
right, General Terry was one of the Masons, and he actually spoke at that dedication in 1858. Of course, no one knew at that time what was going to happen just a couple of years down the road, and after Stonewall Jackson was killed at Chancellorsville, General Terry actually later became commander of what they called the Stonewall Brigade, or Stonewall Jackson's army, and he was the last commander, followed it with Lee to the end of the war. He was much more famous because of his actions close to the end of the Civil War than he was at the time he spoke at the laying of the cornerstone for the new church. And that's when construction began on the current church building we have, the beautiful old church building we have. A lot of people don't realize that it is that old, that it predates the Civil War.
Right.
But the stone foundation was laid, and then early on, services were actually held in the basement, the part where you can still see the stone foundation of the church. And the church itself, a lot of it was constructed during the war, probably with slave labor during the war.
Wow.
And it was dedicated in September of 1863, only about 8 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg. Was when the church was actually dedicated and services began to be held there. And then as we talked about before, another year went by. Those were dark days for the South in the Civil War, and the two churches combined and came back, and since that time have met at the current church there on Church Street in Wytheville. I've always thought, Zach, that, as I said, one of the things I'd like to know a lot more about is that Civil War history. I'm sure you saw the East End Cemetery land, the first land for it was purchased by the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church, and I believe that was in 1862. Mm-hmm. And if you look especially at some of Mary Kegley's records of young men that served during the war, you find that a lot of them ended up and were buried in East End Cemetery, casualties of the war. And it really makes you stop and think that not only the local community, but the Presbyterian Church, the people of Wythe County, really did pay a very great price for the Southern cause during the Civil War. Several people she lists that were casualties in the war are buried in East End Cemetery.
And what maybe some people don't know is things like there were a couple of what is considered to the whole of Civil War as pretty minor skirmishes, but they actually are pretty significant in the Battle of Cove Mountain and Toland's raid and the story of Molly Tynes and all those things that came through Wytheville.
The history of the war was told in the West compared with the big battles that we've all heard about in the East, but those were very, very important, and they were all related to the war that was going on in the East.
Yes.
Just talking a little bit about the battle in the Cove you've mentioned, lots of stories about that, but the Union Army was forced back up the Cove. General John Hunt Morgan was the Confederate general. The battle closed late in the day, and his battle plan was to force a Union surrender the next day. But that night, the Union Army settled after the battle had calmed down and camped around the Cove Church. From there, during the night, they were led out of the Cove and across the mountains in the back and into Pulaski County by a slave who had come from one of the houses up beyond the Cove Church. And so the battle was never actually completed, and Morgan and his men did not come as far up the Cove as the church itself. But the next morning, the ladies there in the Cove that came from those houses came back to the church, and they were found the 17 wounded soldiers in the church, and they took care of them. They were eventually, some were eventually sent to Wytheville and evacuated as prisoners of war. And our stories tell us that there were 7 that died there who were buried somewhere on the church grounds. The church was a mess after it. I've heard stories from my family about the cleanup and what the church looked like. But there are still one place there in the church where there's still some blood stains that we're told were left by the wounded Union soldiers that were left in the church in the Cove.
Well, see, that is so fascinating to me. So fascinating. I did an article many years ago on the 4th of July based on a summation of the Battle of the Cove that Frank Emerson did. And
yes.
Those kind of stories are just amazing to me.
It's a lot of the history that I'm afraid a lot of the people and around our community don't know just how much of that history and what did happen here. And as you were saying, those battles in this area were very important. Of course, the main focus of the Union Army in coming to Wythe County was to cut the railroad.
Exactly.
The railroad was feeding Lee's army in the east, and that was the reason for it.
And a lot of Lee's army did make, I think he owed a great deal to Wythe County.
Many of the supplies came from this area.
Right.
The lead that supported the entire Confederate effort.
Came from
lots of it came from right here in Wythe County. Came from right here in Wythe County.
And
it was very important to the Confederate effort.
Anyway, coming back to the Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian Church did a lot of wonderful things for the community, which I did not know, in that they eventually purchased what would become Plumer College, what are Plumer Apartments today. They purchased that for Wytheville and Wythe County, and of course they were involved in the orphanage at Foster Falls, which was then relocated to the Abingdon Presbyterian Children's Home, which still operates in Wytheville today. So a lot of, and not to mention East End Cemetery, a lot of things that Wytheville has and Wythe County has, we can give thanks to those original Presbyterian members.
And I think a lot of those early members were just like other members of the community. They felt those were services the community needed, and were trying to support their brothers and sisters in the community. Right.
And a few special people that I want to mention that I think are very pertinent to the history of the Wytheville Presbyterian Church. There were two women missionaries that stuck out to me. I don't know were they the Fontaines, were they sisters, Lena and Jeanette Fontaine?
I don't think they were, but they were both missionaries and served in the mission fields.
Right. We have Jeanette Fontaine, who was appointed medical missionary in the Belgian Congo, while Lena was a Bible school teacher in Korea. Both ladies are interred in the East End Cemetery, which was established by the Presbyterian Church in 1863 and then turned over to the town in 1956. Jeanette passed away in 1972 at the age of 85, 86, somewhere around in there. And Lena was, looks like 92 or 93. She passed away in 1981. And they were buried in East End Cemetery. But those ladies and their stories were fascinating to me, and their dedication, as was the Reverend Thomas. Is it pronounced Sproul? Reverend Thomas.
Tom Sproul, yeah.
Yes, he was. We have the same birthday. He was born on my birthday, March 25th, 1920, in Rosemont, Pennsylvania.
I didn't know that.
Came to the Presbyterian Church in 1962, and looks like he was the longest running minister there in all the histories that I could find. He was there from 1962 to 1990, 28 years, and was an active member until his passing in 2010. They proclaimed his birthday, March 25th, 2010, as Dr. Thomas Sproul Day by the town of Wytheville. He was inducted into the Wythe County Sports Hall of Fame, the Wythe County Civic Wall of Honor, and was given Minister of the Year, the Wytheville Jaycees Distinguished Service Award, the Chamber of Commerce Outstanding Citizen Award, among others. What can you say about Dr. Sproul and these Fontaine ladies?
Well, I could talk to you about Dr. Sproul long time.
Okay.
He's the primary minister that I grew up, and actually both as a young adult and an adult was under. First served on the Board of Deacons under Dr. Sproul, known he and his family well, and sponsored youth fellowship while he was a minister here. Had lots of good times with the Sproul family. The Fontaines were older, and I remember them both, but did not know them as well because of the age differences. I remember as I was growing up in the church, they were some of those people that we were kind of, I think you'd call it, in awe of, and knew some of the things that they'd done. There were a couple others of those like that. Speaking of the mission fields, Ben Kelly Jr. served as a missionary in the 50s in the Congo, and of course I knew him better than I knew the Fontaines, but he had many stories to tell about that. And in later years, Bill and Annette Washburn have been members of our church, and Annette now is in a nursing home in Marion, I think. Bill has passed away a few years ago, but they spent many years in Africa as missionaries. So the Presbyterian Church has a good legacy of people that have served in the mission fields.
The longest running tenure of any minister that you've had was in recent years anyway, was Brad Simpson, who I came to know through my work here in the town for years. He was here from 2003 to 2019, and now you have Dr. John Langham, and he will preside over the services for the 200th celebration on October 8th. Also on that celebration, you're going to have a slideshow presentation from Anne Fontaine Sluter.
She's Martha Fontaine's sister. She grew up in the church too. But she still comes back often. We're very proud of her.
Right. And on Sunday, October the 8th at 11 a.m., you'll have a worship message from Reverend Clay McCalley, and music will be performed by the children's choir. Andrew Meeks is doing bagpipes for you all, and a very legendary musician and local legend Edwin Lacey will perform on the banjo with Bob and Bill Lacey. And of course, we all know the Lacey family. Chuck's son Charles was my best friend in high school. I graduated with his daughter Emily. Jane is a wonderful human being. But what can you say about the Lacey family performers?
Well, we're looking forward to it. Those young people have all spent in different areas around, and I haven't seen them together. I think that's one of the things that's kind of exciting, is to bring them all back together here in Wytheville, and we're all looking forward to having them here. And they're going to perform for us. I hope lots of people will be able to come and see them. Of course, that's this regular Sunday morning worship service that you're talking about. We have sent invitations out to lots of people who grew up in the church and have connections here in Wytheville, but have moved away and are not here at this time. But the Lacey's are among many of those that we hope will be back for this 200th anniversary celebration.
Well, I certainly hope so. And it sounds like that it's going to be a great program. I wish I was going to be in town. If I was, I would attend myself. But I'm very thankful to Linda for assigning me the project of covering it for the church. And I'm delighted to have had you on my program, Sid. I have enjoyed talking with you.
Good to hear from you, and glad to be with you. Like, we want to emphasize that people are invited. Certainly an open church service, and we look forward to it. We also thank you, Zach. I appreciate what you do. I always enjoy your column in the paper, and it's always good to hear from you. Good to hear from you this time.
Well, thank you. I have enjoyed that too, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.